Hey friends, welcome back to another Before You Read lecture for our Reading the Bible class. This is the Before You Read lecture for all of Song of Solomon, which you can use and come back to as we move our way through more slowly through the chapters of Song of Solomon. And so I want to do a quick four on the Song of Solomon. So four broad areas to introduce this writing as we begin our study of it. So the first one is its placement within the canon. I'll say a few quick words about that. The second is something about the date, the author, the setting, sort of the literary features, we might say. The third, which will be the longest part of the lecture, is the ways of reading or its history of interpretation. And then the fourth part of the four on the Song of Solomon will be just two questions for you to consider as you read through this writing. So let me begin with the placement in the canon, and I'm going to rely predominantly on the Jewish tradition because there's some interesting things to know from that Jewish tradition. And the first is that it is part of what is known as the Megillot, which is the Hebrew word meaning scrolls. It's included with four other writings: Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. And these five books are part of the broader category within the Hebrew Bible known as the writings. So you might remember that the Hebrew Bible in Jewish tradition has these three main sections: the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. And so the Ketuvim is the final section. It's the writings. And so this is part of the writings. It's part of a subset of the writings known as the Megillot. And there's a couple of reasons why these five books might have been included. One is that they would all fit together in a single scroll, or would get close to filling up a single scroll in antiquity. And the second is that each has a particular use in various religious festivals of the Jewish tradition. So they have a liturgical function. And with the book of Song of Solomon, it was actually typically read at Passover. And for many in the Jewish tradition, is also read, or portions of it are read on Friday night as Jews prepare for Sabbath, as they welcome Sabbath. So just some fascinating placement if you think about it. In our English Bibles, in our Christian Bibles, actually, I should say, it is sort of lumped in with what we would broadly conceive of as the wisdom tradition. So it's song. It's in the vicinity of Psalms and Proverbs. So it's seen more as a wisdom book than as a sort of liturgical book as it is in the Jewish tradition. The second thing that I want to cover in this lecture is just a few notes about the date of the writing, the author, the setting, sort of the typical literary concerns when we are studying a book from the Bible. So it's attributed to Solomon in the first verse in our English translations. Although most scholars agree that this title is probably a later addition. It was probably not original to the text, and it was added in some sense to protect or to garner its authoritative position. Because if it's written by some anonymous person we don't know, it's harder to sort of make a claim about its authenticity or its authority. But if it's connected with Solomon, this really important biblical figure, then we can see why it would be included. And so why would the tradition associate it with Solomon? Well, Solomon was really wise, but he also, we know from other biblical writings, was a lover of women. So it would be fitting for him to be the lover in this text, and so that's part of the attribution. In earlier centuries of modern interpretation, there were debates about whether or not what we know of the Song of Solomon was originally sort of had earlier and later layers, whether or not it had a complex compositional history. And at least according to the Jewish Study Bible, the more recent consensus is that it was probably penned, it was probably completed by a singular author who was likely drawing from earlier traditions, oral or written traditions. But there's an integrity, or a wholeness to the writing, more recent scholarship would say. It's really difficult to date the Song of Solomon. It could be dated anywhere between the 4th and 2nd centuries BCE, based on the forms of the Hebrew words, based on some of the allusions or indicators of the context in which it was written. So therefore, very long after Solomon lived and died, right? But probably certainly written after the exile, moving into the Persian period, or even the early Hellenistic period. It's interesting to ask questions about sort of what is the Song of Solomon. Obviously, it's poetry. If you read the text in Hebrew, you'll recognize that even in translation, it's often broken off into verse format. But the Jewish Study Bible says that there's at least three ways to think about it in terms of its genre or function. One would be that it is sort of a love story. It's just a drama about a love affair, which is meant to entertain or delight or teach, but it has this sort of dramatic feature. A second genre would be that it actually is more of a religious or liturgical text that describes the marriage between a god and goddess. And here scholars would point to similar traditions, similar texts from Mesopotamia, that perhaps the Song of Solomon is borrowing from and even inspired by. And then the third is that it's just simply a collection of poems about human love. No dramatic, no drama necessarily, no performative element, just notes and a collection of a poem that celebrates human love. And as you read this text, what will become clear, although defining them is not always clear, is that there are three overlapping voices. Sometimes they overlap. Sometimes it's hard to know who is speaking. But you have the lover, which is, in the history of interpretation, the male character. You have the beloved, who is identified as a female speaker. And then you have this group identified as the daughters of Jerusalem. They sort of serve the role of a chorus in the Greek dramatic tradition. They're witnessing what's going on. Sometimes they're interpreting it. Sometimes they're drawing it out. So they're definitely characters in this writing. So the beloved, the lover, and the daughters of Jerusalem. I said that the ways of reading or the history of interpretation would be the longest part of this lecture, and it's going to sort of revisit some of what I've said earlier. But the first thing to say is that there is a very early and a very long-standing tradition of reading this text allegorically. And so that is to say that this text does not describe merely human love, but it describes Israel's relationship with God, or God's relationship with Israel. And there is in the Hebrew Bible a tradition of identifying Israel as a bride of Yahweh, as the God, as a bride to the God of Israel. And you can see this in Isaiah 54, Jeremiah 2, Ezekiel 16, Ezekiel 23, and especially and probably most prominently in Hosea chapters 1 through 3. So because of this earlier tradition, there is this longstanding view that this is an allegory. The Jewish Study Bible notes that actually, coming from the Middle Ages period, we only have one singular anonymous commentary that does not engage in this sort of allegorical interpretation. So in many ways, we could say that allegorical reading is one of its first, if not its primary way of reading. This is how the rabbis and much of the rabbis, and how the Targums are this Aramaic sort of translation or paraphrase with commentaries of the Hebrew Bible. They read this as a story about God and Israel. They suggest that this dialogue between the lover and the beloved is happening at the Red Sea, or at Sinai, or at the Tent of Meeting, somewhere in this relationship between Israel and the God of Israel. Jewish mysticism, Jewish mystical traditions, see in this writing an allegory, yes, but a more specific allegory between the soul, the human soul, the individual soul, and God, or perhaps the joining of the male and female aspects of the divine. We see in later traditions in the Talmud that this can be understood as a story about human love, and it was often read at parties or at weddings, and so it captures that. In the HarperCollins Study Bible, in the introduction that's written by Vincent Fox. Vincent Fox was a professor of Hebrew Bible at the University of Wisconsin for a very long time. He actually just passed away this last week or two. He identifies 5 ways of reading this text. And again, there's some overlap with what I've already said, but his 5 ways are to read it as a religious allegory, which I've already covered. To read it as a sacred marriage liturgy, again, which I mentioned in the section above. To read it as a mortuary song, in which it was sort of performed or birthed in a celebration or perhaps even orgies that were meant to celebrate divine or human love over the power of death. And so, sort of seeing human love as a protest to death, maybe at the time of somebody's death or something else like that. A 4th way of reading it is to read it as a wedding song, that it would have been performed or crafted in relationship to an actual wedding. Or finally, the 5th way of reading is as a secular love song. It's a story about love, probably unauthorized love, perhaps erotic, well, certainly erotic, but perhaps premarital love. That's where we get some of that unauthorized way of thinking about the love that it has. And Vincent Fox is going to prefer the 5th way of reading this text. And so as you read, I would encourage you, strongly encourage you, read from both something like the HarperCollins Study Bible, but maybe also read from the Jewish Study Bible, which might give us a balancing of this meaning, and certainly the commentary by Paul Griffiths, who's going to lean more heavily into the allegorical or theological reading of this text. The last part of this before you read lecture is just 2 questions for you to consider as you read. And so the first question is, what does this text teach us about human love and relationships? Here, I would frame that question with a well-known statement from Augustine, that he would say that humans, like our basic human anthropology, is to be a lover, and that sin is predominantly misordered love, and that the process of sanctification, the process of becoming more holy, is about reordering our love. Ultimately, that our highest loves would be devoted to God. And so read this text that is full of language about desire and about longing and all of these things, to say, what does it teach us about human love and relationships? What does it say about human as lover, in other words? What does it say about our capacity for desire, our capacity for love, etc.? And then the second question is, what does this text teach us about God as both a lover and a beloved, both as the one who takes initiative and takes an active role in being the lover, but also is a recipient of love, human love, through worship and through praise and through other sorts of forms of love. All right, friends, that is my Before You Read lecture for Song of Solomon. I won't be doing Before You Read lectures for the shorter components as we read together, but this should give you a sense of the whole as we move more slowly through the book of Song of Solomon over the next several weeks. So thanks for your attention, and as always, happy reading.